intercession, be patient, Saint Anthony, Saint Elizabeth, and Seton, and God's providence, Saint Francis of Lord. Agnus Dei omnipotentis Patris et Spiritus Sancti, Spiritus Manet Sanctorum. All right. God bless you.
So today's talk is on divine providence and peace of mind. The outline of my talk is that I will start with what is divine providence. Then I will move on to things that get in the way of abandonment to providence. And then I will conclude with how to practice abandonment to divine providence. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 302 says, and I quote, "Creation has its own goodness and proper perfection, but it did not spring forth complete from the hands of the Creator. The universe was created in a state of journey, in statu via, toward an ultimate perfection yet to be attained, to which God has destined it. We call divine providence the dispositions by which God guides his creation toward this perfection." Close quote. So what is divine providence? The Catechism said, and I quote, "The universe was created in a state of journey toward an ultimate perfection yet to be attained, to which God has destined it." God has an ultimate perfection in mind, to which we are all invited to partake in. However, I want to make a distinction between providence and God's perfect and direct will. This ultimate perfection that God has in mind is his perfect and direct will, his desire for us. Now we can either choose to partake in his will or to separate ourselves from his will. So, for example, man separates himself from God's will when he partakes in moral evils or mortal sins. Moral evils result from rebellion against God's will, either from the evil one or ourselves, or our flesh. However, nothing happens without God's permission. Everything in the totality is in the hands of God. God never wills or desires sin and evil, but directs everything, including sin and evil, to the final end of his glory. Everything that happens because it was either directly willed or allowed to happen by God. For example, the fall of Adam and Eve is a moral evil that took place, but we give thanks for because it's allowed us to gain such great a Redeemer, Christ. Yet we do not praise the action of the fall in and of itself. We only praise the goodness that came from it. Now I will move into things that get in the way to abandonment to divine providence. Matthew 10:29-31 says, and I quote, Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and not one of them shall fall on the ground without your Father? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, better are you than many sparrows. Close quote. The problem that happens, that causes stress and gets in the way of our abandonment to providence, is that we try to control and contain what is not ours to control and contain, providence. One example is superstition and speculation. Proverbs 18:13 says, and I quote, "He that answereth before he heareth sheweth himself to be a fool, and worthy of confusion." Close quote. In other words, don't speak before you know. Many times, you can know certain things. You can know the way certain things are currently and recognize how God's providence has led you to where you are, but you cannot predict what is to come. For example, this meant to be mentality. It is not wrong that what is meant to be, but we cannot know what is meant to be. Many times people try to predict the future, speculate what is to come before it actually happens. In other words, we put our faith in God, in what he has given us, because many times when we have these preconceived notions and it doesn't take place, it leads to lack of faith and trust in God. Then we lose peace, and that leads to disobedience against God. Many times we have these certain expectations which lead to unnecessary disappointment. You can know what decision to make without knowing what is to come from it. For what is to come from it is beyond you. A seminarian cannot know for certain that God wants him to be a priest until the day of his ordination. But he can know God's providence has led him to be a seminarian. Some may say, why can't we expect and hope that God is going to give us what we ask for? For isn't that what it says in Scripture? For example, Matthew 7:7-8 says, and I quote, "Ask and it shall be given to you. Seek and you shall find. Knock and it shall be opened to you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened." Close quote. So I want to make a distinction here between doubt and abandonment to start. To doubt God and lack faith is to think that either God can't do something, or he won't hear your prayers, or that he couldn't do something that you asked for and didn't hear your prayers. While on the contrary, abandonment is to trust and have faith that God can do it and does hear your prayers and has your best interest in mind and has reason for not granting what was prayed for. Things resulted this way because God chose it as such. Now, I want to go through 7 reasons God does not grant you what you ask for, and this is by Reverend George Leo Haydock in the Haydock commentary on this Matthew verse. So the first reason he says is, because they ask for what is evil, and he that maketh such request offers the Almighty an intolerable injury by wishing to make him, as it were, the author of evil, and God cannot be the author of evil. Second reason, although what they ask be not evil, they seek it for an evil end. And that he quotes St. James, it's St. James chapter 4. St. James chapter 4. The third reason he gives is because they who pray are themselves wicked. For this he quotes St. John's Gospel, chapter 9. For God doth not hear sinners. So for example, once we have been partaken in mortal sin, we have separated ourselves from God's grace. So we need to go to confession first to repair that. Doesn't mean you shouldn't pray if you're in mortal sin, because you still want to have that habit and you want to show God that you're sorry, but go to confession as soon as possible. The fourth reason he gives is because they ask with no faith, or with faith weak and wavering. For this he quotes St. James chapter 1. So, in other words, what I mentioned about faith, about not trusting that God can do it, or that he's not hearing your prayers. The fifth reason he says, and I quote, is because although what we ask be good in itself, yet the Almighty refuses it in order to grant us a greater good. The sixth reason he gives is relating, but a little different. He says, because God wishes us to persevere, as he declares in the parable of the friend asking bread, which is Luke chapter 2, and that we may esteem his gifts the more. So if we wait longer, when we get it, we will enjoy it the much more. The seventh reason he gives is we do not always receive what we beg, because according to St. Augustine, God often does not grant us what we petition for, that he may grant us something more useful and profitable. So those are the 7 reasons that he goes through. So now I've gone through things that get in the way to abandonment. I want to get into how we can have faith and abandonment in God's providence. Everything that takes place on earth should be seen as a preparation for eternity, because that's, at the end of the day, what matters above all. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Remember that there is more to the picture. Enjoy the trees, but don't get attached to them. Abandon control and let go. St. John of the Cross says, and I quote, "All things were given to me the moment I no longer sought them." Close quote. One is not to control future results. We can only make decisions in the present. One ought to leave in the hands of God what is not in their control. You don't have to know why things happen the way they do, but only trust in God's providence. You don't need to know the plan, you just need to trust that it's part of his plan. Abandon your understanding and knowledge to God's providence. Many times we try to speculate and try to predict what is to come, but we have to trust at the end of the day that God has our well-being at the forefront of his mind and knows what is best for us at the end. Also making that distinction between just because it was part of providence doesn't mean I didn't do anything wrong. Many times people get this idea like, oh, God, it was God's providence led me here, therefore what I did in the process was good. But we have to remember, just because God brought good out of it doesn't mean what he did was there for good. We need to stop putting so much focus on exterior evils that are not in our control. For example, like the stuff on the news. For there is nothing you can do about it, and it is part of providence. However, focus your energy on what you can control: habits, virtues, growing in sanctity. For that is what's going to gain you heaven. If God desires it as such, why have you not embraced it? Turn to God and trust in God. Now I want to get into making a distinction between consolation and desolation in decision making. Consolation is good, but not necessary. St. Francis de Sales says, and I quote, "Never be in a hurry. Do everything quietly and in a calm spirit. Do not lose your inner peace for anything whatsoever, even if your whole world seems upset." Close quote. Desolation is not a sign of separation from God's will. Rather, it is a testing and an opportunity to grow in virtue and abandonment. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, in his spiritual exercises, under the chapter on rules for discernment of spirits, part 1, goes through different rules in discerning spirits. Rule number 8 says, and I quote, "When one is in desolation, he should strive in perseverance and patience. This reacts against the vexations that have overtaken him. Let him consider, too, that consolation will soon return, and in the meantime, he must diligently use the means against desolation which have been given in the 6th rule." And the 6th rule says, and I quote, "Though in desolation we must never change our former resolutions, it will be very advantageous to intensify our activity against the desolation. We can insist more upon prayer, upon meditations, and on much examination of ourselves. We can make an effort in a suitable way to do some penance." Close quote. In other words, don't try to make changes and control things during desolation. Rather, persevere through difficulty with abandonment. It is very easy for us, when our life is getting out of order and we feel like there is no progress in the spiritual life, to want to make crazy changes in order to make things feel at ease. However, this is contrary to what is actually advantageous and helpful. Because in desolation, we do not have clear mind and we cannot make clear decisions. So stick to the decisions you chose when you were in consolation. During desolation, God is testing your patience. Wait for a time of consolation to make the decisions with clear perspective. Abandonment does not mean you won't have times of disappointment, anger, irrational emotions, or feelings of unrest or not feeling at peace. However, we are to embrace them and suffer them without meditating upon them and giving them more attention that they deserve or acting upon them. Embrace every cross that is given unto you. So that is my talk. To recap, we need to put the problem that we have it in spiritual life many times is that we try to control what is not ours to control. And in order to solve this, we must let it go and abandon ourselves to God's providence. Thank you.